All right, everybody. So I'm here to discuss this book called The Enablers. It's by Frank Vogl. It's called The Enablers: How the West Supports Kleptocrats and Corruption Endangering Our Democracy by Frank Vogl. Kleptocrats are those dictators that just basically plunder their countries and steal everything. So this is very pertinent in today's world because especially what's going on over there in the Ukraine. But I'll just read this little. Frank Vogl is the founder of or co-founder of Transparency International. So I'll just there he is. I'll just read a little paragraph they have of him here. He is a former senior World Bank official and former business and economics correspondent for the Times of London. He teaches a graduate course at Georgetown University titled Corruption, Conflict Resolution and Security. He is the chair of the board of directors of the Partnership for Transparency Fund and the co-founder and former vice chair of Transparency International, the global non-governmental anti-corruption organization. He served as president of Vogl Communications Inc., an international communications consulting firm, until 2018. So I got a few little tidbits out of the book, but it's just really disturbing. There's a lot of problems in this world that would be solved automatically if somehow you could just wipe out corruption. If you could wipe out corruption, then a good majority of the other problems in this world would be solved. But I'll read a few little tidbits I took out of the book. We'll start with, so Frank Vogl said that David Lipton is a former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and he said the amount of private wealth in offshore financial centers, such as the Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands, is about $7 trillion. That's 8% of the world's GDP. He said the more the West provides kleptocratic regimes with weapons and open financial markets for their investments, the more the West adds strength and power to these regimes. Ones that ultimately advocate for autocracy over democracy and mock our values of human rights, anti-corruption, and freedom. That's why Frank Vogl calls it the enablers, because you do have these corrupt kleptocrats and dictators, but they couldn't do what they did if they didn't have people enabling them. And so, we're enabling them as well here in the United States. And Frank Vogl says the bankers are the most prominent set of enablers. If the banks would stop enabling them, then they wouldn't be able to move beyond that. But the banks enable them to, move their money in, and then it enables them to, purchase the high-end real estate, the art, whatever else they do with that money. So the bankers, if they would just put a stop, then that would really solve a good portion of the problem. A U.S. Senate committee said the art industry is considered the largest legal unregulated industry in the U.S., permitting purchasers to buy pieces without any record of the transactions. And that's the art world. The poor, now, he mentions, the poor people in poor countries are the biggest victims of corruption. Because if you got rid of the corruption, then these guys plunder their countries, steal everything, and leave their citizens to starve and live in squalor and poverty. And I'll give you an example. The former president of Angola is President Jose Eduardo dos Santos. He was president of Angola for almost 4 decades, from 1979 till 2017. His daughter Isabel dos Santos just happens to now be the richest woman in Africa, worth between $2 and $3 billion. You know, they control hundreds of companies and offshore accounts. And then Frank Vogl did mention that his successor to the presidency actually turned the tables on him and pressed corruption charges. So I'm not sure where they're at with that today, but you know, they've no doubt run out of the country with all the money. But again, Angola has one of the highest poverty rates in Africa, while their people are living in squalor and abject poverty. They're stealing everything. I mean, they just stole everything. Like, you do that to your own people. One little interesting tidbit: Frank Vogl said that there are millions of companies registered in Delaware. So there are many times more companies registered in Delaware than people living there. And I'd have to do more research. That's because there's, you know, they've got some sort of obscure laws where you know, can register companies there and get away with certain things. But that was interesting. And I remember when this happened, and Frank Vogl mentioned it in the book. In October of 2020, Goldman Sachs paid over $4 billion in fines to settle cases involving international bribery and money laundering. And that's just the fines. The fines were $4 billion. I'm thinking that some of that had to do with that fund in Malaysia that was plundered, and Goldman Sachs enabled that to happen. And a couple of their bankers were arrested and I think found guilty and put in prison. But you know, just think, that's just the fines, $4 billion. And they wrote that check and moved on. And on that day, I remember on that day that happened, analysts were saying, okay, yeah, Goldman Sachs has passed this, we're moving forward, and it's time to buy their stock again. And a lot of bankers, like Frank Vogl mentioned, a lot of bankers will just say that's just the cost of doing business. That's just another cost. Now, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development says that $88.6 billion in annual outflows of illicit finance leave the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. So the countries of sub-Saharan Africa see $88.6 billion leave, and you know, they're illicit funds, you know, basically being stolen. Just think what $88.6 billion a year could do in Africa, because the total foreign aid flowing into Africa is $48 billion, and total direct investment inflows are $54 billion. But yeah, the total foreign aid flowing into Africa every year is $48 billion, while at the same time there's $88 billion flowing out of Africa being stolen. So, you know, that's just something else. Leaves you speechless. Now there's a index called the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, and it rates how citizens and businesses perceive government corruption, and the score ranges from 0 to 100. 100 meaning that there's zero corruption, and 0 meaning that you're totally corrupt. But 180 countries are ranked, and over 2/3 of the countries score below 50. Frank Vogl says that democracy is in retreat across most of the world, so we're actually going backwards instead of forwards. Then he also put a little clip of FBI Director Christopher Wray's speech from February of 2020, and I'll read it to you. This is very interesting. So this is again the FBI Director Christopher Wray in February of 2020. He said China is using a wide range of methods and techniques, and I'm talking about everything from cyber intrusions to corrupting trusted insiders. They're even engaged in outright physical theft, and they've pioneered an expensive approach to stealing innovation through a wide range of actors, including not just Chinese intelligence services, but state-owned companies, ostensibly private companies, certain kinds of graduate students and researchers in universities, and a whole variety of other actors, all working on their behalf. And he goes on and says, but it's also a diverse threat when it comes to the sectors and sizes of China's targets here in the U.S. We're talking about everything from Fortune 100 companies to Silicon Valley startups, from government and academia to high tech and even agriculture. Even as I stand here talking with you today, the FBI has about 1,000 investigations involving China's attempted theft of US-based technology in all 56 of our field offices and spanning just about every sector and industry. So that's pretty disturbing. Let's see, where am I here? Okay, so now Frank Vogl mentioned that economists at the International Monetary Fund have estimated that global corruption costs between 1.5% and 2% of global GDP. That's just really huge, extremely huge. Denmark ranks number one in that consumer, in the corruption perception index that I just mentioned that scores from 0 to 100. Denmark is ranked number one with the highest score, which means they have the least corruption of any country on earth. However, Frank Vogl mentioned that in 2018, Denmark's largest bank, Danske Bank, was found by banking authorities to have been responsible for laundering more than $235 billion of mostly Russian money. So there you go, right? Now, and then he mentioned Sudan's president, Omar Hassan Ahmad al-Bashir, served from 1993 till 2019, and he was prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. He was prosecuted for overseeing wholesale ethnic cleansing, rape, and murder in Darfur. But as this was happening, and the whole world knew this was happening, France's largest bank, BNP Paribas, laundered over $6 billion that had been stolen from the citizens of Sudan, and they laundered this for al-Bashir. BNP executives of this bank tried to hide this by moving illicit cash into investments in the U.S., established special corporate entities in offshore tax havens that keep identity secret, and they also produced fraudulent documents. So there you go, France's largest bank. Now the Boston Consulting Group says that just from the Great Recession in 2000 and 2008 up until 2016, so just in that 8-year span from 2008 to 2016, $321 billion in fines were paid by major banks for all assorted acts of wrongdoing. Now just think of that. Major banks have paid $321 billion in fines for criminal activity just in that 8-year period. That tells you the extent of this money laundering is in the trillions if they're paying $321 billion in fines, and then they consider it just a cost of doing business. The organization called Americans for Financial Reform said financial firms spent over $2 billion to influence Washington decision-making in the 2017 and 18 election cycle. Russian money flows not just to banks, but it also flows to public relations firms, charities, political interests, academia, and cultural institutions. Also, the U.S. Treasury, they have a unit called the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and they said the 30% of all high-end purchases in major metropolitan areas here in the United States are by owners or representatives who were the subjects of previous suspicious activity reports. So again, that's 30% of all high-end purchases in major metropolitan areas involved the owners or representatives who were the subject of previous suspicious activity reports. That's corruption for you. And these kleptocrats and oligarchs, they love real estate. There's an area of London, they call it Londongrad, because the Russian oligarchs have bought so many of these, $50 million mansions. And but yeah, they love to invest in real estate and art and other luxury items and yachts, of course. But again, I think if everybody knew the information in this book, there would be a lot more pressure on politicians and bankers and others to cut down on the corruption. But yeah, I would definitely highly recommend everybody read. I don't know how that is in the camera. If you can see it there, like there. But it's The Enablers by Frank Vogl. Yeah, please read it. It's a great resource, and I'm glad Frank Vogl went through all the work to put this together. So thank you, Frank Vogl. Have a good day, everybody.